The American defense of the Philippines in 1942 is remembered as a valiant effort to hold off the unstoppable Japanese army. The conquest of the Philippines by Japan is the worst major military defeat in United States history. After just 4 months of fighting, over 23,000 American military personnel were killed or captured, while embedded Filipino soldiers killed or captured totaled over 100,000. The soldiers fought well, but the overall defense plan was horribly incompetent, resulting in a rapid defeat by a smaller Japanese force. Most blame falls upon the overall commander, General Douglas MacArthur, although senior generals in Washington, D.C. had approved his incompetent plan. The problem was MacArthur's celebrity status and ego. He was the son of an Army general, a division commander in World War I, a former superintendent of West Point, a former Army chief of staff, had served in the Philippines, and worked in the Philippines after retirement as military advisor to the Philippine government. MacArthur was a friend of Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, who had recommended him for this command. When MacArthur took command in the Philippines in July 1941, he complained that the official defensive strategy approved by Washington, called War Plan Orange, was, quote, defeatist. This plan acknowledged that it was impossible to defend a huge archipelago like the Philippines against an enemy with air and naval superiority that could land anywhere. It called for delaying actions to inflict casualties on invading forces while withdrawing to defensible positions stocked with supplies on the Bataan Peninsula, adjacent to island forts in Manila Bay. This would deny the Japanese access to vital port facilities at Manila, Cavite, and Subic Bay. The U.S. Navy estimated that it would require at least 2 years for its fleet to fight its way across the Pacific to save the Philippine garrison. Army planners believed supplies would be exhausted within 6 months and American troops would surrender. In addition, the Army Medical Corps warned that Bataan was infested with malaria and had no major medical facilities. MacArthur advocated a politically popular plan that would defend the entire archipelago, and this was approved by generals in Washington. Generals were optimistic since the U.S. Army's budget had increased 400% for 1941, and lots of new equipment and personnel began to flow to the Pacific. Thousands more American soldiers were sent to the Philippines, and Filipino divisions were mobilized. The United States sent 35 new B-17 bombers to the Philippines that generals assumed could smash an invading Japanese fleet. The American force had several advantages. It was fighting on home turf and had years to prepare. 5 fortified islands were armed with heavy guns. The Americans had strong support from Filipinos who provided most of the Army's manpower, while civilians provided great intelligence and food supplies. The nation was mountainous, so strong defensive positions were possible. Despite these advantages, the entire American force ended up dead or captured within 4 months. MacArthur's plan proved disastrous from the start. Clark Field was the only airfield big enough for bombers in the Philippines, but was within easy range of Japanese aircraft based in Formosa. When war came, half of the 35 B-17s were destroyed on the ground at Clark by a Japanese airstrike 2 days after Pearl Harbor. The surviving B-17s attacked the invading Japanese fleet, but found that hitting ships with bombs from high above was nearly impossible. After a few days, the B-17s were withdrawn to safe bases in distant Java and Australia. After losses at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and the loss of most American aircraft in the Philippines on December 9th, the Navy withdrew its 3 vulnerable destroyers from Manila Bay to join its other small warships in the central Philippines. The Navy sent several submarines to attack the invading Japanese fleet, but caused no harm because their torpedoes were defective, so they fled too. American fighter aircraft ran out of machine gun ammunition and were destroyed or withdrawn southward. Without air cover, a ship convoy of Army equipment and supplies en route to the Philippines before war began was diverted to Hawaii. The Japanese landed its main invasion force at Lingayen Gulf and attacked south toward Manila, just as the American war plan had predicted. This was the only route that avoided mountains and could use a developed road and rail network. American divisions in the north were unable to stop this force. Smaller Japanese forces landed at several locations in the Philippines and quickly routed the few defending forces. American forces were dispersed over long distances, while stockpiles of supplies remained in the Manila region for shipment to wherever the Japanese had landed. MacArthur's strategic reserve was just 2 infantry divisions that were difficult to deploy. The main island of Luzon had rail lines that were quickly knocked out by Japanese aircraft. The limited road network was full of refugees and patrolled by Japanese fighters. Moreover, the U.S. Army had few trucks in the Philippines to move men and materiel anywhere. General MacArthur reverted to War Plan Orange for defending only Manila Bay and the Bataan Peninsula. This was madness, since supplies to resist a long siege were in Manila and no defensive positions had been constructed. There must have been objections by officers on MacArthur's staff and generals in Washington, but MacArthur's celebrity reputation deterred debate. MacArthur's decision helped the Japanese trap and destroy the American force, but he could blame War Plan Orange. American forces fought the advancing Japanese on the Luzon Plain to allow units from southern Luzon to move northward into Bataan. This left the American force exhausted, demoralized, and with few supplies. The Army even permitted 26,000 refugees, many were family members of Filipino soldiers, to join the retreat into Bataan, where they suffered and used up scarce food and water. Withdrawing into a peninsula was a bad idea, since the Japanese had complete naval superiority. This allowed Japanese warships to bombard American units and to land troops and supplies ashore. The jungles of Bataan were full of mosquitoes that infected most soldiers with disabling malaria. The primary problem for the Japanese was moving supplies to Bataan. But this was solved after Fort Wint, guarding Subic Bay, was abandoned without firing a shot. Its guns were spiked, ammunitions blown up, and soldiers withdrawn. This allowed Japanese cargo ships access to the excellent port facilities at Subic. Army history excuses his blunder as just confusion. No investigation was later done, and no one held responsible for this criminal incompetence. There were several options to prevent the inevitable disastrous mass surrender at Bataan. Once the Army divisions in the north failed to hold back the main invasion, many Filipino troops could have been sent home with a few months' pay and all the weaponry and ammo they could carry to continue to fight as guerrillas, as many eventually did on their own. This would have tied up large numbers of Japanese troops and resources for the entire war. Army headquarters staff in Manila, key Philippine government officials, diplomats, and family members were mindlessly sent to the Corregidor fortress in Manila Bay, where they outnumbered the combat soldiers 2-1. They suffered and consumed scarce food and water during the Japanese siege. This resulted in a major propaganda victory for the Japanese when 14 American generals were captured, pictured here. Civilians and most general officers should have been evacuated southward, where substantial American forces remained. A Japanese division had landed at Lamon Bay, but was held up in the mountains south of Manila by 2 divisions. MacArthur's 2 reserve divisions from Manila could have joined them in a counterattack while evacuating to the south. But MacArthur ordered all 4 of them to retreat northward and to the Bataan Trap. The U.S. Army had no recent experience in defensive operations and failed to employ the basic tactic of mobile defense against a rapidly advancing force. MacArthur should have formed a couple dozen 100-man light infantry units that hid from advancing Japanese combat forces and ambushed supply convoys. Such units could have operated in the mountains near Manila Bay to harass Japanese forces assembling to bombard and invade Corregidor. These would have halted Japanese advances until they redeployed thousands of soldiers for convoy escort and static guard duties. The U.S. Army had spent millions of dollars to build 4 fortified islands protecting the entrance to Manila Bay and 1 for Subic Bay prior to World War I. These were armed with large guns encased in concrete. They were designed to withstand direct fire from ships, but not indirect fire from aircraft or howitzers firing from Bataan. For unknown reasons, the Army never built sandbag revetments to protect the guns or coastal bunkers and obstacles to repel the expected amphibious assault. Forces at the 5 Army forts were under strength. The U.S. Army had the 31st Infantry Regiment of American troops near Manila that should have been used to fully man these forts and improve defenses. Instead, they were sent to Bataan with few supplies to fight from foxholes where they were killed or captured. Corregidor was the largest island fort and had a few small beaches where Japanese troops could land. It had no infantry force to defend it until the 4th Marine Regiment arrived after war began. It had fled occupation duty in China and only had 1,000 Marines. A couple thousand sailors, clerks, and Filipinos were added, but this was an insufficient force to defend the island. The addition of an Army infantry regiment and a few tanks to support counterattacks would have made invading that island nearly impossible. Since island defenses were weak, 2 Japanese battalions landed and quickly captured Corregidor, even though the defenders outnumbered them. General Wainwright gave up quickly since he worried that the thousands of civilians in the island's tunnels would be harmed. He ordered all American forces in the Philippines to surrender, to include those on the 3 other island forts. If American and Filipino soldiers had been dispersed to fight as mobile units, fought to withdraw southward, or were sent to help defend the island forts, none would have been captured at Bataan. If supplies and manpower were sent to these forts rather than Bataan, they could have improved defenses, held out months longer, and inflicted much greater losses on the Japanese. American forces would have been forced to eventually surrender, but this would have resulted in just a few thousand captured. None of these ideas to avoid mass surrender required brilliance, just common sense. The failed defense of the Philippines is a tale of U.S. Army dysfunction. MacArthur's grandiose defensive plan was doomed to fail, and when it did, he ordered forces to Bataan, where food was limited and escape impossible. MacArthur was never overruled during this madness, nor fired for this blunder. His friends in Washington spun this disaster into a valiant stand against the Japanese tidal wave. This myth is perpetuated in official histories, but facts show this was the worst military defeat in United States history.